Okay, so thank you everyone for attending tonight for this WordPress accessibility primer. I'll be honest, a third of it, the first third of it is really going to be more generalized accessibility, and then we will get more detailed into WordPress. I have spent the last couple weeks trimming my slide deck because I was already over 100 slides, and it's like, oh, that's right, there's a time limit, which you would think I would know. So I trimmed it, and then I'll be honest, Joel, who asked a question on the Meetup site, asked a few questions, and because of him, there's 4 more slides. So I apologize, but I blame Joel for that. So let's go ahead and begin. The one thing you'll notice is at the very bottom of the screen, you should see captions. So first off, there may or there may not be anyone who's attending this particular meetup who may need captions. Ideally, we would have a human being transcribe what I am saying, and it would be posted on the screen here. But I'll be honest, I don't have a budget for that. Many people don't have a budget for that. I'm using Google Slides for the very first time for this presentation deck. And one of the reasons why I decided to go this route is because it does offer auto slides. I mean, PowerPoint offers it as well. There may be some other services that offered it. So I'm really giving this a sort of a kick the tires moment to see how it works. The actual recording of this presentation will be captioned in a more typical way, but we're going to see how these captions turn out for this recording. Let's see here. Okay, so a little bit about myself briefly, so this way we can get into the presentation. I started in accessibility in 2014. I actually started, I was a front-end web developer, and I was looking to migrate to user experience. And it just so happened that the Air Carriers Accessibility Act, I always have to be careful of the acronym there, that came about, and United Airlines, along with all the airlines that operate in the United States, had to meet certain compliance standards for accessibility. So basically, I latched onto that as a method to get to user experience. And I'll be honest, I never went all the way. I just stayed with accessibility. I've loved it ever since. It really has changed my professional life. So I really, hopefully, as you'll be able to tell during this presentation, that I love talking about accessibility. I got my accessibility chops starting at United Airlines. I am the founder and former organizer of the Chicago Digital Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup. They are still in existence. I have just stepped down, but my co-organizer at the time, Nick, he is running it. If after tonight you have a further interest in accessibility in general, you might want to check out that meetup. It's meetup.com/A11YCHI. So you can go out there and join that particular meetup. I'm also the founder and former editor of 24A11Y.com. That's an annual advent calendar type article series that started back in 2017. It ran for 3 years. I stepped down because it was just too much work for me. I handed it off to a coworker, actually, who's ran it. We didn't run it last year, but there's 3 years worth of articles. I definitely would say check it out if you have a further interest in accessibility. I created a Twitter account, A11Y Advice, which basically posted daily tips. It's on hiatus now because I, again, just got so busy, but I will be picking up on that, likely posting more things about mobile accessibility. I've presented at various WordCamps and meetups for WordPress, and I'm presently an accessibility engineer at the PACEO group. So tonight, the agenda, we're going to talk what is digital accessibility and why should we be thinking about digital accessibility. We're going to then go immediately into accessibility testing. And then we're going to talk about how accessibility applies to WordPress, the content, the themes, and the plugins. There will be a list of resources at the end. By the way, there is the deck for this. I will be sharing out the URL at the end of this presentation. I've already posted it on the meetup page for this event. So you'll have access to all the information as well as all the links. So, people are not disabled. The environment, the websites and mobile apps that we create disable people with varying impairments, whether permanently, temporarily, or situationally. And this is as sort of a paraphrase of a quote that someone who I met at a accessibility conference years ago, his name is, oh God, Jamie Knight. I believe it's Jamie Knight. Just by the way, I'm awful with names. So I always struggle to remember who people are. But Jamie Knight, he's a brilliant fellow. He works for the BBC. And he really opened my eyes to the fact that, you know, people will have physical impairments, but it's not that impairment that disables them. It's the environment around them. So say, for instance, if you're in a wheelchair, if you don't have curb cuts with those slanted ramps where people can ride up instead of going up and over a curb, it's that curb that is the disability, not their impairment. So I just want you to think about that as we continue on this evening. So able-bodied individuals have privilege. So as designers, if you think of it, we design for individuals like us, and it's just nature, it's our habit. We like those low contrast designs or all caps headings, which by the way is a personal pet peeve of mine. We like tiny text. We never consider beyond the design, the art of the design. Is it usable? Can everyone use this? It's got to be accessible, right? Can people with varying abilities use this site or app easily without troubles, without stress and anxiety, without physical harm? I once heard a designer tell me, blind people don't book air travel. Really? Is that even possible that someone would think that? As developers, we code with the latest frameworks using the latest JavaScript techniques. A developer says, I can use it, anyone can use it. Until an individual with a physical impairment cannot use it, cannot activate that button with a keyboard, cannot reference that form field, using speech-to-text assistive technology because we coded the ARIA attribute differently than the visible label. Design, development, and content matter. So let's talk about the different disabilities, or in this case, let's talk about the impairments. You know, if you think of it, and something that I'm trying to craft, there's no such thing as a disability. There's varying abilities. So let's talk about impairments. So there's vision impairments. Individuals who are blind, have low vision, color blindness. Do realize that when someone is labeled as being blind, it doesn't mean that they see pitch black. They can actually see, every blind individual sees different levels or see a varying degree of light, of shape, of colors. Hearing impaired, deaf, hard of hearing, motor impaired, individuals with cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, paralysis, also difficulty just using a mouse, a lack of fine motor control, and slow reaction time. And then you have cognitive and learning disabilities. These are what we consider the invisible disabilities. So, when you see someone walking towards you, you have no idea because there's nothing visible that denotes them as someone with an impairment. But someone who's walking past you or you are interacting with very much may have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or anxiety or short-term memory loss. One item that's not here are seizures. So you can have something that's flashing on the screen and someone can actually become physically ill and begin having seizures. So, as lighthearted as it sounds, we never want to develop or design our websites to cause harm to individuals. If you think beyond the impairments, a commuter who's on a train, maybe they forgot their earbuds at home. They can watch an instructive video if they have access to captions. An outdoors lover, a worker outside on a sunny day, they may be attempting to view content on their smartphone, but because of the glare of the bright sun and the low contrast on that screen, they're unable to view that information. You can have a worker walking to their car. Let's say a woman with a baby walking to their car and she's attempting to order dinner from a mobile app. You have to think about, how are these things designed? One of the pain points right now, that's something that's not technically a compliance failure, are very tiny touch points where, if you need to tap on a button on a mobile device, on a website, that button is too small when it's on a mobile device. And then you have major multitaskers, workers listening to articles read out by a screen reader while working on reports. I am one who actually have no problem, I can read articles, but many times I'm trying to do something else as well. So I'll actually let a screen reader read the article, a blog post or whatever, while I'm working. And if you think of it, it's just like having an audiobook or a podcast. So why should we care about digital accessibility? So the first thing, it's easy to say, it's the right thing to do. That, from my experience, and as you can imagine, doesn't get too far, especially like if you're trying to sell accessibility to a client and say, hey, it's the right thing to do, we should do accessibility. But when they find out there may be some additional cost involved in doing something like that, let's say if it's a redesign or you're adding a new feature that needs some additional development work, they may not want to pay for it. But the one thing you want to consider is the fact that, the market, the disability market, there I said disability again, the size of the disability market is the size of the population of China. I think I saw something about there's like 1.4 billion individuals living in China. That's how many people there are with impairments or disabilities worldwide. Wouldn't you want that audience to be able to have access to your website, to come to your website because it is accessible? Search engine optimization. Search engines are basically blind users. The content that search engines digest, devour, is textual. So if you have, let's say you have a podcast on your website, you have an audio player. If you don't have a transcript to go along with that podcast, how's a search engine supposed to do anything with it? They'll have, you know, a title, they'll have a page heading, and then except for a few words that act as a brief description about this week's episode of the podcast, there's nothing for the search engine to really use to determine its theme or how it should rank and such. So text is king when it comes to search engines. Same thing that goes with providing text alternatives for images. So those are sort of the benefits of doing digital accessibility. There are some risks, however, to avoid. So there's an avoidance factor. There's always that potential for lawsuits. If you think of it, back in 2008, there was a famous lawsuit from Target. Basically, there were blind users who attempted to use the website, purchase things on the website, and they were unable to for various reasons. They worked with the American Federation of the Blind to get Target to fix these issues. And basically, Target didn't respond. That was the key thing. They did not respond. So they were sued. The key thing here is they were sued and they settled out of court. What would have cost them, let's say, $300,000 to fix, ended up costing them $10 million. Okay, I want you to think about that. $300,000 versus $10 million. It sounds like, you know, accessibility is something that really should be done. There were 3,550 accessibility-related digital lawsuits last year in 2020, and that's up 23% from 2019. The retail industry accounts for over 77% of all cases, followed by food service and education. The lawsuits were primarily directed at desktop websites, but also mobile apps and video accessibility. 250 lawsuits were filed in 2020 that were using widgets or overlays as an accessibility solution. So I'm sure you've seen by chance a website that may have a button that's stuck to the side of the screen that allows the user to increase or decrease the fonts on the screen or inverse the colors. That, or the overlay solution, where basically vendors will promise that they just fix your website by including this JavaScript or whatever. Many of those websites are still being sued for accessibility issues. 250 lawsuits were filed last year. And then additionally, there's always the possibility that you're going to have new laws come into play. Prior to 2016, there was a movement by the Department of Justice to mandate what online websites needed to be compliant with for accessibility. And that basically got shelved around 2016 with a different administration. Now with the new administration, I mean, you've already seen we have, for every press conference, we have someone doing sign language. So it's a sense that there's a possibility that a mandate will come about that websites need to be accessible to a certain degree. So that's something that's coming in the future that we need to pay attention to. Just a couple thoughts here. Digital accessibility is a level of quality. So if you think of it, you know, and I always think of Dan Cederholm when I think about craftsmanship when it comes to code. But basically when we look at a website to where something's broken, something is misaligned, a button doesn't work, we think of that as a QA problem. We need a bug fix. But accessibility itself as well is a level of quality. If you have a button that says continue, but someone has coded it on the back end to where the name of that button is purchased, and let's say they forgot to change that name, someone who's using speech-to-text software is not going to be able to reference it. And obviously that's a problem. That's a problem pointing to quality. Digital accessibility is based on the spectrum. Again, you have levels of accessibility. If someone just fixes all the, or adds text alternatives to all their images, that site is more accessible. Is it completely accessible? Likely not. So accessibility is really based on the spectrum, and accessibility is an ongoing activity. It's the way I look at it is it's a new way of thinking. Just like people consider performance or security when building a website, people also need to consider digital accessibility. Now, things that digital accessibility is not. It's not a feature. I have, if you want to see my blood pressure rise, I'll watch certain accounts on Twitter, and you'll see someone file or post a tweet that's complaining about a particular product, and the product folks, the social media account for the product, will come back and say, you know, file a feature request. Well, you know, the ability to use a website via just a keyboard, that's not a feature. That's baseline accessibility. So digital accessibility is not a feature. It's also not an absolute. There's not, it's an accessible or it's not. Many times you can implement a feature that adds additional level of accessibility and actually make it inaccessible for someone else. One of the common beliefs is that if you have black text on a white background, well, that's fantastic color contrast. So that's going to be perfect for everyone. And in actuality, there are some individuals who that would actually cause harm to them. They won't be able to read the information that's on the screen because it hurts their eyes. And then lastly, digital accessibility is not a set it and forget it activity. Once you've made something inaccessible, if there's any other changes going in, if you're adding content, everything needs to be viewed with a digital accessibility lens. So I saw this and I needed to share this as a sort of just a brief intro to what we call WCAG. So this was on the White House website and on their accessibility statement, which, by the way, the White House website did not have an accessibility statement for the past 4 years. Now it does have an accessibility statement, and they are working to conform to what's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We call it in the industry, if you want to call it, WCAG, W-C-A-G. And we're at currently version 2.1, and there's 3 levels, level A, level AA, and level AAA. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. But basically, the baseline conformance level for most sites and many legal settlements and such is WCAG 2.1 level AA. So speaking of WCAG AA and WCAG 2.1, there's 4 principles of digital accessibility. The content needs to be perceivable, so you need to be able to read it. If a modal dialog modal window pops up, you have to perceive that it exists, even if you're blind. I can tell you stories of when we were testing the websites at United Airlines back in the day. We had a blind tester who was trying to do something and it couldn't because a modal dialog had popped up and it was not labeled. Focus had not been applied to it, so therefore their screen reader never announced it. Let's see here. Operable. A website needs to be must be able to navigate to all user-face components and operate those components. And that's primarily with a keyboard, but there's other methods as well to operate and navigate a website other than a keyboard and other than a mouse. So again, we need to consider, how would I do something without a mouse? A website needs to be understandable. And a lot of that has to do with the language. So setting the language of a page, for most folks, especially when you're just visually trying to look at a web page, it doesn't make any difference, you know, whether I have it there or not. And it's not a case to where your website is internationalized. So this way you might have language variations. So that's not it. A web page, for instance, must have its language denoted. So this way a screen reader knows how to pronounce the content on the website. So think about that as you know, you're building pages and, oh, that's right, I need a lang attribute on this HTML element. And then finally, robust. Robust, I always call the developer principle, because much of it applies to user interface elements, the properties, the name, the value, and the state. So for instance, you have a disclosure widget, you click on it, content appears. That value of collapsed or expanded, that is something that is communicated to assistive technology. Visually, you don't see anything. Maybe you see the arrow point up or down, depending on whether it's collapsed or expanded. But a screen reader user is not going to understand, you know, what's happening, what state it's in, unless we pass along that information. So I mentioned the levels of accessibility, and again, WCAG has 3 levels. Level A, and level A is sort of your very baseline accessibility, your text alternatives for images, your semantic markup for headings, lists, and tables. A reading order makes sense, keyboard accessibility, page titles, focus order, things like that. Level AA would include things like orientation, and this comes into play with mobile devices. If I turn my device from portrait to landscape, does the site adapt to that? Is there a minimum text contrast or even non-text contrast? Can I zoom or resize the text? Those are the things that are covered in level AA. AAA is what we call the idealistic, what we strive for. But I'll be honest, very few sites can call themselves AAA. I do actually have a AAA website, a WordPress website, that I will show you near the end of this presentation. But basically, level AAA covers things like no time limit. So if you have sessions, there's no time limit. There's no, you know, resetting or closing a session. The link's purpose, the link text, describes the context of what the link does. You don't need the content around it. Touch target size, as I had mentioned before, that's covered in this. There's actually a new version of WCAG coming out, 2.2, probably mid-year, that's actually going to make touch target a AA compliance item. So it will actually be something that sites looking to meet AA compliance, something that they will need to have. So, okay, so how accessible are websites? What is the state of our digital world? WebAIM has performed a report, an analysis of the top 1 million website homepages, only the homepages. And these are what's called automatically detectable errors. So this is not your, you know, I was about to say color contrast, but it does check color contrast. It's things that you can check via the code. It can determine, does an image, you know, an IMG element, does it have an alt attribute? And is there a value in that alt attribute? Those are the things that it can check. The analysis came up with something that's, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, very depressing. It's run for 2 years now. Of the home pages that they analyzed, the top 1 million website home pages, 60.9 errors per homepage. That's up 2.1% from 2019. Over 98% had errors, up from 97.8% in 2019. Automatically detectable errors represent only 30% of all errors, okay? The top errors that it uncovered are as follows. So these are the things that most sites get wrong, okay? Low contrast of text. 86% of all home pages had low color contrast issues, and that's up 1% from the prior year. Missing alternative text for images. That is 60% of all home pages, and that's actually improved by 2% from the prior year. Empty links and empty buttons. So, and I was thinking about it, so where would that be coming from? That's actually coming from, and you probably have seen it, when you have a button that has just an icon. Well, if that icon does not have a text alternative, then that that button or that link does not have text to go by to give it its name. Therefore, it's considered empty, okay? Missing form input labels. So there's many cases where you'll have text above a text input. It'll say first name, but in all actuality, when you go into that text input, that adjacent text is not programmatically associated with that form field, and that is a problem, okay? And then, as I mentioned prior, the missing document language, which is so important for screen reader users. So quickly, before we go into testing, just to talk about the different types of assistive technology. Screen readers. So everyone has access to a screen reader. If you have a PC, you can download either NVDA or JAWS. We'll go into more detail with screen readers in a moment. But if you have a mobile device on your iPhone, you have VoiceOver pre-installed. On an Android device, you have TalkBack, and it may be pre-installed, or you can just download it from the Play Store. And you can use it at any time. Now, I will say, and again, I don't want to go into too much detail about screen readers yet, but when I first attempted to use a screen reader on my Android phone, I locked myself out. So as many of you may already know, men do not like to read instructions, okay? I proved that fact, that stereotype. Okay, I just said, oh, let me just turn it on. Let me see what happens. After I locked myself out of the phone, and eventually I got back in after some 15 sweaty moments, I then read up, okay, what are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to do it? Okay, so there's screen readers. There's refreshable Braille displays. Refreshable Braille displays, as you know, Braille are those tiny raised dots that individuals with vision impairments use to read letters, words, sentences, okay? A refreshable Braille display just is the digital version of that. They can read the content on the screen, and they basically run their fingers over the dots, and then when they finish the line, they'll hit a button, and then it'll refresh, and then they can read the next line. This is very important for individuals who are blind and deaf. I've actually run into that when I ran the Chicago Accessibility Meetup, where we had an individual who was blind and deaf, and there was literally no way to communicate with them. Luckily, we had a translator who had showed up for the event after about 15 minutes, who assisted this individual. But yeah, so that's what a refreshable Braille display is about. Switches, if you think of the, I can't think of the office supply store, but basically that red big button. So that's basically what switches are. They basically send off-on, yes-no responses to a computer, and it allows them to interact with a computer. Puff and sip, that's basically a tube that a user who, let's say, has motor impairments, let's say they're paralyzed, they can actually still interact with a computer. Screen magnifiers, individuals who have low vision, who need a very large display. It's funny with websites, we typically think of, okay, like maybe 200% and such. When we did user testing at United Airlines, we saw individuals who went up to 800% to see the screen. And then lastly, gaming. Microsoft actually has a whole console for individuals with physical disabilities, and they came out with that a couple years ago, and it's proved very popular. So testing for accessibility. So there's two types. There's automated testing, which again can detect approximately 30% of all errors. And this is a good method to begin your testing to catch the low-hanging fruit, the foundational issues. And there's a bunch of testing tools, and we're going to go into those in just a little bit. Manual testing then validates the false positives that may have been detected as positives by automated testing, and then you test everything else. And manual testing is like using a screen reader, using a keyboard, doing code validation, making sure that things were coded properly. Again, keyboard, screen reader, and code inspection. The last type of testing is with actual users. So, many of these things are done by web or mobile professionals. They know how to code, they know all about computers and stuff, but you do not get a true sense of whether something is accessible unless you have actual users. At United Airlines, our QA department actually hired a visually impaired individual who performed screen reader testing as a user with all of the code releases. And they still work there, and they're still very active with that type of work. So testing tools. The good news, all of these are free. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is basically what was on the top of my head. And this is actually what I use on a regular basis. Color Contrast Analyzer, that's by my company, TVG. Chrome has two tools in the browser itself, in the web dev. So when you hit F12, you get the web development panel pop up. There is an inspect element tooltip as well as an accessibility inspector that will help give you information about the accessibility properties of elements on the page. Firefox also has an accessibility inspector. There's a wave tool, which is it's created by the same company that has done those reports, that WebAIM Million analysis. It's by WebAIM, the wave tool. And it's very popular. It's very good. The Arc Toolkit that happens to be created by my company, TPG, and that's a Chrome extension, as well as Axe, A-X-E. That is a Chrome and Firefox extension that's created by a company called DQ, D-E-Q-U-E. So, Color Contrast Analyzer. This is client software. You download it either for Windows or Mac. And basically, you can enter in the foreground and background colors to determine whether or not it passes the three success criteria that's in WCAG. You can also use an eyedropper tool to sample if you don't have access to the code or to the color codes to gather that. I recently did an audit on a very progressive website, and I found their color codes to be very difficult to obtain. So there was a few instances where I used the eyedropper tool. And then you can alter, if you have a failure, you can actually alter the colors here to shift them enough to where they are compliant. So you can actually use this tool to come up with new colors and compliant colors. It reports on the 3 WCAG success criteria, and there's also a color blindness simulator. Once again, the Chrome Inspect Element tooltip. You open up the web developer panel, hitting F12. When you hit the inspect button, as you hover over elements, it'll give you information like the color contrast, like the accessible name of the element, the role of the element, whether it has an appropriate role, as well as if the element is keyboard focusable. So that's very valuable and important information that you can gather completely for free. The Chrome Accessibility Inspector is also in the web developer panel. And if you select accessibility, you'll get all this information as far as what the actual label is. And again, that may differ from what the visible label is. You want to make sure that those are the same, or else individuals, again, with speech to text software will not be able to reference that. Make sure things have the proper role, and so on. Firefox, again, has a very similar accessibility inspector that can be used to gather information. Let me go back to the Firefox Accessibility Inspector. The one thing that this has that is very valuable, that's also on the Arc Toolkit, but here you get this without having to download anything, is you'll notice this check mark with the label of beta next to it. It says show tabbing order. If you select that, it'll basically show you each focusable element and in the order that it appears. And as you tab, it'll show you which one has the current focus. So that's a very valuable tool when you have focus order issues. The Wave Chrome and Firefox browser extension, once again, this is a very popular tool. I would say that this is the first tool that most people who are trying to do accessibility, this is the first tool that they will get access to. And it's a very fine tool. My company makes the tool Arc Toolkit. It's a Chrome extension. It will basically runs a report on a website and then breaks things down by types of items like media, structure, navigation, so on and so forth, and then reports back showing you the code. It reports the issues, tells you what WCAG success criteria that failure applies to, and then gives you a very brief recommendation. And lastly, we have the Axe tool. This is very much like the Arc Toolkit. You run a report and it gives you the information on what the issues are, as well as how to fix them. So that's the automated tools. The manual tools are very, it's very simple, but yet most people don't realize it. So for instance, the first item of manual testing is just to use your keyboard. Press the tab key to move keyboard focus to each interactive tool and find out, can I actually access those, can I access that button that's stuck to the screen on the right? Can I activate the tools? Can I press the enter key or the space key to activate that item? Does the order, the focus order, make sense? Can you visually tell which interactive item control has focus? Then there's screen readers. Now, again, for Windows, there's JAWS and NVDA. JAWS is free to download, but it basically comes downloaded in demo mode. So that means that it will run perfectly fully run for 40 minutes. If you want to use it again, you must reboot. And the purpose for this is that they designed this so this way people wouldn't use it to test websites. That's actually against their license. However, people still do to a point. NVDA, the thing is, JAWS is the market leader. It's actually the most robust of all those screen readers. NVDA is a free option. It's also quite popular. It's not quite as robust, but the features to where it's not robust typically are not going to impact someone who's performing accessibility testing or is just using it for the first time. So again, we have a link out to it. You might want to check that out if you are on Windows. On the Mac, you have VoiceOver. It's pre-installed, it's free. All you have to do is turn it on, enable it. Once it's enabled, all you have to do is hit Command F5 and it'll start up. Let me just turn mine on for a second and you'll see what happens. If I hit Command F5.
VoiceOver on Chrome. Speaker
so
notes. To enable screen read.
Hopefully, there we go. So the one thing to note is the screen readers are best paired with certain browsers. So JAWS is great to use with Chrome. NVDA works best with Firefox. On the Mac, VoiceOver naturally works great on Safari. Not so well on Chrome, as you may have just determined there. On mobile, again, on Android, TalkBack is free. It works well with Chrome as well as Firefox. And on iOS, VoiceOver comes free and pre-installed, and it works best with Safari. WebAIM also has on their site a screen reader users survey. They're now doing it every other year, but basically that survey provides a great level of insight into the habits of screen reader users. If you want to delve into that a little bit further, I would definitely check that out on the WebAIM site. So screen reader testing, very much like keyboard testing, you're going to press the tab key. You're going to verify that when you hit a button, it provides you with the visible name. It announces that. It also announces that what you've landed on is a button. If you're on a tab panel, it should announce that it's on a tab. That's the role. If you have a disclosure widget and it's expanded or opened, it should announce expanded. These are things that you check for when you're doing screen reader testing. You also use the arrow keys to read the page. So when you're using tab, you're hitting all the interactive elements. When you use the arrow keys, you're reading the page. You're reading through each element, whether it be textual content or an interactive element like a link or a button. And then there's code inspection. Very much like any other, any good developer, you're going to inspect your code to ensure that information is accurate, okay? And then I mentioned actual users. This is actually a photo from when a day when we did some user testing on the united.com website. And the users that you see there seated, these are all individuals who have vision impairments, and also a few of them had vision and hearing impairments. So it was very interesting to watch them interact with the website, as well as us interacting with them to communicate, to get information as far as what they were experiencing and what they were thinking of the product. So finally, now, WordPress, okay? And it's been a while, but now we're going to get to the heart of the presentation here. So first off, I've been involved with WordPress off and on, since maybe the mid 2000s, so 2004, 2005. It's been quite a while. But the thing is, I've been involved with WordPress off and on. I'll be involved in a site, I'll build a website, and then I'll get busy at work and won't touch it for a year and a half. And then I'll get back to WordPress. So I've been sort of off and on. I've actually been on more this past year or so. working on a particular client of mine's website. Actually, we've had a couple websites working with. So I've been more involved with WordPress. But if you think of it, when us working with WordPress, and this is something that we've chosen, obviously this is why we're attending tonight, this community meetup, WordPress powers 34% of all the websites on the internet. WordPress powers 14, almost 15% of the world's top websites. Imagine if we as WordPress designers and developers made all of our sites accessible. Think about the impact that we could have on accessibility worldwide in the digital world. So, WordPress accessibility. Is WordPress accessible out of the box? Well, it depends. It depends on the context, what we're talking about, okay? So if you think of it, the WordPress architecture is the admin, the interface, and the database. The database, of course, is just a database, so it's only as accessible as the interface that accesses it. The WordPress admin interface is fairly accessible. I am not going to speak to Gutenberg because I'm still not a huge fan of it, but also when it was released, originally released, it had major accessibility issues. And I do know that many of those have been resolved, have been fixed. However, I am not personally comfortable with stating how accessible it is. So WordPress, for the most part, is accessible, the product that you download. Now, the content that us bloggers as content developers, publishers and such, that content is only as accessible as what we put into our website. If we place an image on a page and we forget to add the text alternative, well, now you've just made that page inaccessible to a degree. Same thing for textual content. If you have headings, if you're styling text without actually marking them up as headings, that's a disservice because someone using a screen reader can actually navigate a website based on headings alone. And now if you don't mark up the website using headings, you've taken away that capability. Themes, this is the look and feel of the content. So again, this is not only the structure of the pages that we see, it's not only the design, the color contrast, the ability to zoom, but it's also some of the interactivity. So if you have a website that a theme implements tabs that you've put into custom content blocks and they appear in different tabs, if that tab interface is not accessible, that's where themes can actually fail a website as far as accessibility. And then plugins. Plugins are one of the major issues when it comes to accessibility on a website because themes, those are things not only that we download and we can test and look at, but those are things that we build as WordPress professionals. We build themes. So we have control over whether or not a theme is accessible. Plugins, on the other hand, not everyone builds plugins. There may be some individuals at this meetup tonight who do build plugins, but the majority of folks just download them and say, "Oh, this plugin does what I want my site to do," but they don't typically test the results of that plugin to see if what it spits out is accessible. At any stage, a WordPress site can become mucked up. So, WordPress content. The common content elements that impact accessibility are images, headings, lists, tables, audio, and video. So for images, we have this image in the media library. We have this panel, and this panel is so key to accessibility. So you'll notice that the first text box for the image properties is alt text. If you don't place anything there, it's either going to leave an empty alt attribute or it's going to leave no attribute. And if there is no attribute, a screen reader is going to try to find the next best thing. And unfortunately, that next best thing very much could be the file name. So if you look at this particular image, if it read out that file name, it would be very frustrating for a screen reader user to hear that announced to them. There is a plugin which we'll discuss by Joe Dolson that basically encourages you, let's put it this way, encourages you to add alt text for an image. And there's actually a decision tree. I believe I've provided the links to it. There's a decision tree that helps you understand when you need alt text and what that alt text should be. Okay, alt text should be applied to all informative images, any images that communicate information. They need a text alternative. Decorative images, they should be ignored by screen readers. So if you think of it, decorative images are a visual aesthetic to a website. A screen reader user is likely not going to be interested that you have a sunflower bleeding off, an artwork of a sunflower bleeding off on the upper right-hand corner of your page. WordPress provides alt text fields for images in the media library. Use it when appropriate, okay? And again, here's that link to that alt decision tree. It's very valuable to determine when you should use alt text and what that alt text should be. Now, here's where Joel comes in. So Joel was asking about maps. So this is a route map from United Airlines about 6-7 years ago. What I want everyone to think about just for a few seconds is, what would be the alt text for this image? It very well could be something as generic as domestic United States route map, okay? But if you think of it, does that actually communicate appropriately what this map is illustrating? To be honest, when I first started in accessibility, when I looked at this, it's like, what am I, as a visual user, supposed to get out of this? I see a bunch of lines. I can sort of tell where the hubs are, because that's where all the lines are coming from. But outside of that, it really didn't tell me anything. So, if you think of a textual alternative, providing one for this is almost impossible. Funny enough, this image was in a PDF format. So that actually adds another layer of inaccessibility for this information. So what we did was we created an interactive map and using Google Maps. Now you may say, so how do I make Google Maps accessible? Well, again, it comes back down to text. You need to provide the same information that is being displayed visually, graphically, in a textual format. So in this case, this is the route map on the United Airlines website. They have a search box. You type in your routes from, so the airport you're flying out of, and then when you perform a search, it provides you with a list of the destinations that you can fly to from that origination, from that originating airport. So basically all these dots represents places where you can fly to. And here you have a textual listing of that same information. Now there are improvements. It's funny, when I looked at this for the first time in 3 years, when I looked at this, it was like, oh, I wonder why they didn't do this, or I wonder why they didn't do that. But as of now, it is technically accessible because it provides the same information to those people who cannot view this visually as the individuals who are viewing this visually. Another example from the United Airlines website. So here you have an airport terminal map. Okay, these are very popular. But how would you take this information, all the information that is communicated via text, via all these icons, and mind you, the page that this graphic appears in, they do have a legend for all these different icons. So the question is, how would you provide a text alternative for this type of infographic or this complex image? Well, the way you would do it, now you could just say, well, I would just describe it saying, you know, Terminal 5 covers, you know, these airlines, United, Aer Lingus, Air India, and so on and so forth. Yes, but that would be very verbose. Let's say if actually you just wanted to get to Terminal 1 and you wanted to hear about Concourse C in Terminal 1, but you'd have to listen to all these other terminals of information because the information is being provided like text alternatives in a linear fashion. So how would you do that? Well, we came up with a table. Now, visually, you will never see this table. This table appears directly under that image I just showed you, but it's visually hidden on the page, but in a way to where screen readers can still get to it. Okay, for those of you who like to go in and hack code and, you know, change CSS properties and stuff, you can see this table on the airport terminal pages. And tables are very easy for a screen reader user to navigate. So they can literally get to, if I just want to find out about whether there's a terminal walkway at Terminal 2, they can navigate to Terminal 2 column, terminal walkway row, and determine that there is no terminal walkway. Okay. Headings. Headings are very important. Headings not only provide structure to a page, but they also allow a screen reader user to navigate. They can actually just navigate by headings to get to the content that they're looking for. Okay. A post page title on a page is marked up typically and should be marked up as an H1, a heading level 1. There should only be one page heading or a heading level 1 per post or page. Now, there is and there always has been a lot of discussion since HTML5 came out, because HTML5 communicated that a page could have multiple H1s. And technically you can. There's nothing that breaks anything. However, if you're looking for something that gives a hierarchy of this is what the page is about, and each one of these sections is about this subset of this main topic or theme, then you would only have one H1, and then all subsequent headings are H2, and if you have a subsection of that section, then that might be an H3, okay? Groups of subtopical content should have their own subheading. All headings should be descriptive, no marketees. Doing an audit today, I'm looking at a statement that's marked up as a heading, and many times content authors on WordPress will use a heading because it gives it the font size or the styling that they're looking for. Okay, don't add heading styling via for visual purposes. Only mark up text using a heading for semantic purposes. Okay, lists. You know, there's still people who will use a dash space and then start typing, and then, you know, either hit return or, God forbid, they'll hit shift return to put a soft break, and then they'll put in dash space. That's not a list. When you have a properly marked up list, it can be easily navigated. A screen reader will say list with 4 items or a list with 12 items. If you do it the hacky way, if you want to call it, a screen reader user is not going to get that information. Okay, so you use unordered lists, obviously, for list of things that are not in any particular order. Ordered list, the reverse of that, and you use that for when things have a specific order. There's also definition lists. The problem is as far as I could tell, Gutenberg does not provide the capability to select a definition list. Definition lists are typically pairs of information. So, you know, say if you have a definition list of sock colors, you know, you can have, or socks, you could have color being a term, and then the definition of that, the DD of that would be turquoise. And I don't know why that just came off the top of my head, but that would be an example. A very common example would be a glossary. So if you want to think of it like that. Some screen readers do have issues with definition lists and the number of items in that list. So you just want to use those with caution. Tables. So tables must have column headings. There's so many people who still today, even though we've had CSS since the mid 1990s, still use tables for layout. There's ways to overcome that, but tables should never be used for layout. They should only be used for tabular data, and tabular data has table columns, and those must be marked up appropriately. If you have multiple tables on a page, you want to give it a caption. And you know, if you don't want that caption to appear, you can always hide it. You can visually hide it, but it's still there for a screen reader user, and the caption labels a table, okay? WordPress creates tables with row headings. Well, I'm sorry, it's missing row headings. And the problem with that is that there's some cases where row headings are very valuable, but the funny thing is, at least the last time I checked, Safari, VoiceOver Safari, does not announce row headings even if they're present, okay? Audio. So when you have audio, you must provide a textual alternative, and that textual alternative is in the format of a transcript. Again, this is where actually this benefits you when it comes to SEO, okay? You should provide that transcript adjacent to the player, so this way the individual can see and read the transcript, but also, let's say if they want to go back, they can go back. The player is adjacent, it's nearby. They can easily make changes to it. Alternatively, if there's no real estate on the page, you can provide a link to the transcript. It's not as beneficial because now the user either has to do the transcript and you have an audio someplace else. If they need to make a change, if they want to pause, they need to actually navigate to that other location to make changes to the fact that the audio is playing. Obviously, the content is important, but here also the player needs to be accessible, and many times that's keyboard accessibility, making sure you can get to all the controls as well as the controls are announced. I do have a WordPress plugin that provides an accessible player. We'll get to that once we get to plugins. Video, same sort of thing, where you provide a transcript, but you also provide captions. And you'll notice here the slide says captions, not craptions. So YouTube. YouTube is one of the more popular platforms. There's also Vimeo, but let's talk about YouTube here. YouTube automatically provide, well, if you have the setting turned on, I should say that, automatically creates automatic captions for videos that you upload. Now, those automated captions are only as good as the speaking quality of the speaker or speakers in the video, the environmental noises. So, you know, if you're on the street corner and you got people blowing their horns, and while you're talking, there's a good chance it may not pick up exactly what you wanted to pick up. One of the things here is that automatic captions, or craptions, as it's called, can actually be very embarrassing. There's so many embarrassing examples. If you do auto caption bloopers or auto captions mistakes or whatever, you'll find some hilarious examples on YouTube of that. So it's okay to do auto captions, but I would say you have to clean them up. You have to, you make a promise. If you're going to do video uploads, you also have to clean up those captions, okay? If you want to go further and to be AA compliant, if your video offers information that's not addressed in the audio track, then you must provide audio description. Audio description basically describes either text that's on the screen that's not in the audio track, or action. If any of you have either on Netflix or any of your streaming services, if you've ever watched a movie, television show, or whatever that has audio description turned on, it's very fascinating because basically it's a description of everything that's happening visually. And if you think of it, individuals with vision impairments, they need that. That's the only way they're going to get information. They may hear someone what sounds like running and they're huffing and puffing, but where, who, are they being chased? What? So this information is passed along in audio description. Again, a textual alternative, a transcript. If you think of it for video, if you are blind and you are also deaf, how are you going to get the information? Well, if you have a transcript, that individual can use assistive technology, let's say to use that refreshable Braille keyboard to actually find out what is being communicated in that video, okay? And of course, like audio, you need an accessible player. Do not have your videos auto start. I'm a huge fan of going to CNN.com. And one of the big problems is once you get to an article and you're scrolling down, you're reading and such, and all of a sudden, about a minute or so after you arrived on the page, here comes some audio playing. And for me, unfortunately, the volume is always too loud and it shocks me. And, if that shocks me, imagine what it does to other people. So never have your videos auto start on your website, okay? Captions, timing is everything. Okay, so this is just a quick example that I recently saw that I had to share. If you don't recognize what the video is here, this is a show called Beat Bobby Flay. He's a very well-known chef, and there's a competition show on Food Network to where people compete to then compete against Bobby Flay. And one of the big dramatic moments at the end is to find out who won, who, did the contestant beat Bobby Flay. So typically, the host, and the hosts change every episode, the host will say, and the winner is, and then there's, this high tension, dramatic music in the background, different visuals showing members of the audience what's going to happen and such. And then they announce who won. That is key to the show. That's key to what makes the show interesting. However, if your captions don't match that, it gets ruined. So I'm just going to play this very brief clip here and you'll see what I mean. If you look at the captions, and the winner is Chef Bobby Flay. Now, mind you, yeah, then they announce it. So as you see here, whoever was captioning was just captioning. I just got to get these words out there. But it actually created a disconnect between the tension that the visual and audio show provides versus the textual captions that were provided there. Okay, WordPress themes. So are themes accessible? Themes available on WordPress.com are reviewed, but not specifically for accessibility. Only those themes that have been uploaded that are tagged with the feature accessibility ready, those themes are then reviewed for accessibility, and there's criteria that they need to meet. To be honest, that criteria is not WCAG 2.1 AA compliant. There's a lot of aspects that meet that, but not everything. And so that's a shame, but it's better than nothing. Right now, as of this past weekend, there's 42 accessibility ready themes on WordPress.com. Again, these can be deemed accessible only until you start adding content and plugins. That's where then that theme will go south with regards to accessibility. So common theme factors that impact accessibility include, but are not limited to, text color contrast, non-text color contrast. And just so you know, that means, let's say if you have a button where the color of the button against its background and along the text on the image, let's say has low color contrast, then that makes that button have low color contrast and makes it difficult for someone with vision issues to see that. Focus indication, where am I on the page? Skip links and ARIA landmark roles. So this way I can skip over, let's say you have navigation on every page. Once I've been on the page and I'm on page 3, I don't need to go through the navigation. I just want to get to the content. Those mechanisms are available. Forms, again, labeling of forms. If there's errors, making sure those errors are appropriate and are announced. Responsive layout, keyboard accessibility and operability. Headings, again, you know, content will provide headings, but there's headings that are also provided from within the theme, so that needs to be considered. Content links. One of my favorites, I believe I touched upon this, are your read more, you know, the infamous WordPress read more links, content links, template images, and components. So just running through some of these here. Text color contrast. Text and images of text must have a color contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1, except for large text, which needs to be 3 to 1, or if it's decorative or a logo type. So here's 2 examples. The first example shows low color contrast. You have a golden button with white text, so that makes it very difficult to see. And of course, the text above it is sort of this teal text on this sort of dark gray background, makes it very difficult to see. Underneath it, you have a more accessible example to where the increased has, the contrast has been increased. So non-text color contrast, again, the visual presentation of user interface components for graphical objects must have a color contrast ratio of 3 to 1 against adjacent colors. So on top, we have a input field, first name, placeholder text that acts as its visible label. But the visible label has low color contrast, as well as its border. It only has a bottom border, and that is very low. So someone with a low vision may not be able to see that there's even a form field there. Same thing for the continue button, very low color contrast. Beneath that, the first name field and the continue button, we have a much greater color contrast. Focus indication. So where am I on the page? One of the #1 things, and I'm sorry for any of the designers who are on this call, I'm going to mention this. One of the #1 things that designers like to do is to implement outline 0 or outline none. So basically what that does is that takes away the default browser focus indicator that helps people understand where am I on a page, what element has focus at this time. Do not do this. In fact, there's a website called Outline None, don't do it. So don't do it. If you need to, create custom focus styles. So this way they are, if you want to say more attractive based on your design. do realize that in future versions of WCAG, they're going to say that you need to have at least a minimum level of color contrast. So this way, those focus indications can be seen. Skip links. So here's 2 examples. Amazon, you're on the Amazon homepage. You know that their navigation is epic. It's very large. It takes a lot of pressing the tab key to get through. However, the first tab that you press, you'll see this highlighted link that says skip to main content. And that allows a user to go skip all of this, you know, the search box, all this navigation heading that's on every page, and skip directly to the content to get to that. You know, if you think of it, us sighted non-motor impaired users who use a mouse, we have it easy. Okay, we're on the page, we scroll down, we get to this, you know, very easy. Someone who's dependent on a keyboard has a more difficult time. Someone who depends on a keyboard and a screen reader has an even more difficult time. So implement a skip link at all costs to make sure that people can skip these repeatable navigation elements. Landmark regions are a similar way of providing regions that people, a screen reader user, can use to pick, okay, I want to go to the main region, or else I want to go to the content info region, which happens to be the footer, or a navigation region. These are landmark regions in HTML5. There's also ARIA attributes that match those HTML5 attributes. Form inputs. So make sure that you have a visible label. And one of the favorite things of web folks is to use the placeholder attribute to have the label be the text inside the text input. The problem is, as soon as the individual starts typing in that input, that label goes away. Now, an able-bodied person, a privileged able-bodied person, might say, well, that's fine. I know I'm on the street address input field. That's fine for you, but there might be someone who literally forget, what field is this? Or becomes confused as far as, is this, you know, a street address 1 or street address 2? You know, is this where I type in my unit number, or is this where I put in the street address? I'm not sure. So don't use placeholder as the visible label for a text input. Actually, leave an actual visible label always present. There's ways where you can use floating, where it can look like it's inside the text field, and then when they type, it floats up. There's techniques out there for that. You'll also notice that underneath here, you have text that is underneath the text input. And that might provide helpful information to give you a hint of what you should be putting in there. And there's ways to associate that information using ARIA described by. You can associate that with the text field. The placeholder should really only be used to provide an example of what to input, an example of what's expected, not information about what should be put in, and definitely not the label. Okay, states, if you have a required field, make sure you visually display that, but also there's ways to programmatically indicate that that field is a required field. Make sure that you address that. And of course, we have links here to explain how to do that. Grouping related links. So especially with radio buttons and with checkboxes, if you have a group of them with an overarching label, make sure that you mark it up to where you create a group, that you create a legend with the pre-existing text. When a user navigates into that set of controls, they'll actually hear that automatically. The screen reader does that for them. And provides the same information, obviously, that we can get visually. Form errors, the same thing. You need to make sure that you're providing appropriate information, so this way the user can fix the error. You need to indicate that information, and don't just use color, use other characters to indicate that something has an error. And also error messages, make sure that you're cognizant of color contrast. I cannot tell you how many times at work I fail text messages because the color of red they use fails against the white background. Responsive, make sure that your layouts adapt to different screen widths and zoom levels. Always use relative sizes for containers and fonts, and do not disable zoom. You should never have control of the design. The user should have control, what they need to obtain the content. Okay, keyboard accessible and operable. Make sure that all interactive elements ideally are using native elements like buttons and links. If you create custom elements, make sure that they have keyboard accessibility built in mind. Make sure they're in the tab index, focus order. Make sure they're operable, not just by a mouse, but also keyboard. Make sure that focus indication is there, and make sure the focus order makes sense. The image that you see here is the focus order of a Wikipedia page. And I'll say no more. I saw that the fact that you have an item that is 2,586 in the focus order just blows me away there. So headings, again, in your themes, when you're presenting the post title or page title, make sure that's the H1. And if you are presenting additional content through the theme, make sure that you're using appropriate section headings or subheadings. Same thing for links. Don't use read more, learn more, because whenever I see that, read more, learn more, my first question is, read more about what? Learn more about what? Okay, so this is where it gets a little dicey. So technically this is not a failure of AA, because as long as the content around that read more explains what the context is, that is acceptable. AAA, level AAA, where things are even more accessible, says that the link text alone provides the context. And the reason why I find that so important is if you look on the right side here, you'll see this box that says links. This is the VoiceOver links list. So I can basically look at this and determine each link by its text to determine which link I wish to follow. I can then, scroll down or move down to, let's say, pixels and relative versus relative units in CSS. I can decide to go to that particular link and follow that, okay? Make sure that you don't use URLs for link text. The first time you hear that read out by a screen reader, you'll know why. And then also make sure that links that open up in a new window are indicated as such. Use an icon, and then make sure that that information also gets passed along to screen reader users. Images that are presented by the template. Informational images must provide text alternatives. If they're decorative, you can leave the alt attribute empty. That basically causes Assistive Technology to ignore it. Informational images should not be presented as a CSS background image, because then that makes it more difficult to provide that text alternative. Images, icons that are presented by a button or link must provide a text alternative, or else that button and link will not likely have an accessible name, and they'll be just announced as link or button without any text. Components, so you have components in your theme. Let's say you have a modal dialog or disclosure widget or tab panel. Do these controls have a role or a name? Are they announced as a tab? And will the tab text be announced by a screen reader? Is the state provided and updated appropriately? So when I expand a disclosure, one of those show hide controls, does it announce that it is expanded? That's only done if I code it properly. And then can it be navigated and operated by a keyboard user? We have a link there to the way ARIA authoring practices. One little note about that, they provide the specified attributes for components and they provide good patterns. However, and you'll notice by the notes on this particular resource that they're based on specifications and they're not considering the browser or assistive technology support at this time. So when you head down the route of using a pattern that's in this authoring practices, make sure that you test as you develop. Okay, WordPress plugins. So again, accessible plugins. Plugins, unlike themes, they are not reviewed for accessibility. Plugins can introduce accessibility issues not found in the content or theme. I have experienced this myself. There are plugins that I don't care about that I can easily replace, and then there's plugins that I must use that they introduce accessibility issues. And to be honest, with those, I will try to reach out to the plugin maker and point out, here's the things where, where we have gaps, where we have weaknesses, and this is all that needs to be done, with the hope that in a future release, in a future update, those changes will be made. And obviously, if they're using something like GitHub, you can do it in a typical formal process, but otherwise, just contact the plugin authors. Types of plugins that can frequently create or introduce accessibility issues are things like carousels, lightboxes, forms. Form plugins are infamous for providing you with form fields, but maybe the labels are not associated, or maybe the error messages are not associated or announced, or maybe status messages, confirmation messages are not announced. So again, lightboxes. When a lightbox is presented, does the screen reader announce its role, dialogue, and its name? Can I reach any or all of the controls within the lightbox? One of the famous or common issues with dialogues is while the dialogue appears, the focus is not placed on the dialogue, which means that as you start tabbing, you're actually on the page behind the dialogue. And in many cases, the dialogue code is at the end of the page, and you have to tab through the entire page before all of a sudden your focus is now on the dialogue. Can I reach any of all controls in the lightbox? If I press the tab key, will I stay within the lightbox or move outside the lightbox? And then can I access the content's text alternative? So again, with the lightbox, you're presenting typically an image. Well, is there alt text? Okay. One other thing that's not listed here for lightboxes, like a dialogue, is when I close it, does focus then move back to the control in which the lightbox was generated? Okay. If focus doesn't go back to where you were, you can easily become disoriented, let's say if you're a screen reader user, or if you're a motor impaired user. Now you have to work to get back to where you were. Carousels. Can I reach any or all of the carousel controls that move me forward or backwards? Are the controls announced with forward or backwards? I cannot tell you how many times carousel controls may just say button. Well, that doesn't help me. Which button is this? Can all carousel content be accessed and accounted by screen reader users? And of course, I will always go back to, whenever I see a carousel, I will always go back to the website. Should I use a carousel? If you ever want to talk a client out of using a carousel, you might want to check out that website. Tables, testing plugins for accessibility. So I am a huge lover of TablePress. I use it for a particular client who has a lot of tabular data that's actually managed in Google Sheets, but then we bring it into the website using this particular plugin. Table columns are marked up properly as headings, but there's not a really great way to do table captions. If you sort the columns, now I've not tested this because we don't use it, but if you start sorting the table columns, is that information and the sort direction communicated to screen reader users, okay? Again, sort state, is it properly announced by screen reader users? Forms, I'm a big user of Contact Form 7. The good news is, by default, it creates good forms, but they're not exactly accessible. The good news is that there's a plugin for that. There's a plugin to actually make it accessible. Okay, there's also plugins to actually improve the accessibility of your website. So the most famous one, and the one I suggest everyone install, is WP Accessibility. It's by Joe Dolson. It doesn't make your site compliant, but it improves various aspects of your website, the accessibility of your website, including it adds a skip link. It adds the language and the text direction attributes to your HTML attribute. It makes sure that you have those keyboard focus indicators. It adds that outline that you may have taken away. It enforces the alt attributes for images in the classic editor. It identifies images without alt attributes in the media library. And it adds labels to the standard WordPress form fields for the search and comments. And it will strip title attributes from images, which some people who value SEO a bit too much may still want to use the title attribute. However, let me explain to you, the title attribute creates overly verbose links, controls, whatever. So when you have a title attribute, not only does that link text, let's say if you place it on a link, not only does that link text get announced, then it announces whatever's in the title attribute. And, I guess what I would suggest is if you've implemented that, use a screen reader, listen to it, and I can almost bet that you'll say, okay, I don't want to do that. And let me take that off, okay? Joe Dolson has also created that accessibility plugin for Contact Form 7. For new forms that are created in Contact 7, it will provide various aspects of accessibility. It'll wrap associated form fields. It'll make sure those, it'll add the ARIA described by attributes to error messages for failed validation. So yeah, I'm just looking at the highlights because I'm trying to move just a little bit faster. I know I've been going on here a while. There's also accessibility plugins for Gravity Forms, as well as for the Genesis framework by, and then Able Player. So this is the Able Player plugin. If you have audio, if you have video, I would highly suggest that you install and play with this plugin. I will say that it's not going to win design awards, but it's going to make your media, your audio and your video accessible, okay? Follow that link, check out the documentation as well as the examples. The examples are fascinating. You can have synchronized sign language video with your videos. It's just amazing. Yeah, check that out and definitely consider using that for all your media on your websites. You may have heard of overlay solutions, and we discussed this a little while ago. There's a great quote by Carl Groves that sort of sums it up. Sole reliance on, and in this case is Accessibility, and Accessibility does have a plugin for WordPress, will not be sufficient in ensuring full and equal access to your website. There is a full report on this, as well as more information about web accessibility overlays, links in the slide. I would definitely suggest that if you're encountering this or if you're considering this, you want to check out that information before you move any further. Okay, accessible WordPress website. Lainey Feingold is a lawyer, a disability rights lawyer, and she is a huge accessibility advocate. What I want to do is I want to show you her website. So first off, I'm going to assume and guess that you can see her website that I'm sharing right now. The key is that this website is WCAG 2.1 AAA. So this is as accessible as it's going to get, if you want to say. I'm just going to briefly turn on a screen reader, and I'm going to show you how this site acts as I navigate it. So let's see if I can do some live screen reader navigation and not embarrass myself.
Voiceover on Safari. Law Office of Lainey Feingold. Structured negotiation for link. Link. Search for search text feed search button. Visited link heading level 1. Law Office of Lainey Feingold.
So the first thing when you start
Law Office of Lainey Feingold.
When you start playing with a screen reader, the first key that you're going to learn about is the control key. Screen reader announcements can become very verbose because they're providing a lot of information, not only what's on the link or control, but additional helpful information that's coming from the screen reader itself. And many times you're trying to talk, like during this presentation. If you hit the control button, it's going to pause the screen reader from talking. If I hit it again, or actually if I hit any other key,
collapsed link about primary menu.
It'll continue talking, as you say. Learn about, if you start playing with screen reader, just know that your control key is going to pause it without turning it off, and this way you can get a word in edgewise. So right now I'm just tabbing through the site and hitting all the focusable elements. I'm on the navigation right now, and I want you to see something that's very important as I navigate through the navigation.
Link, settlements, collapsed, visited, link, book, collapsed, link, speaking, link, legal update, link, topics, link, contact, link, collapsed, link. So you saw that first off, I have drop-down menu. And if I hover, link,
over
expanded, expanded.
Quiet. If I hover over these drop-downs, on hover, the drop-downs appear. So this way it's convenient for a mouse user. However, you don't want that to happen with a keyboard user, and especially a keyboard user using a screen reader, because that means that to get through all of the navigation, I have to navigate through all the sub-navigation, all the sub-menus and stuff. So this has been coded to where it acts the way you would want it to act on hover when using a mouse, but when you're using a keyboard, it only hits the top level and you have to press space or enter to open up the menu. You'll also notice that here's the speaking menu and the sub-menu is open. It's expanded. Well, you'll notice that the screen reader announced expanded, link, speaking. So it provided the name, speaking, the role, link, and the state, in this case, expanded, okay?
Link, 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 top link, contact. You are currently on a link.
Now, the other thing I can do, as I mentioned before, is I can navigate the site via headings, okay? On VoiceOver, that's the control option, which are called the VoiceOver keys. Hitting Command and then H for headings. So let's see if I can navigate headings without embarrassing myself.
Heading level 1, welcome. Heading level 2, why dolphins? Heading level 2, invite Lainey to speak. Heading level 2, read Lainey's book. Heading level 2, recent articles. You are
Okay, so let me just turn off VoiceOver. So
VoiceOver off.
So as you see, it's fairly easy to begin using a screen reader. And as you see, there's many powerful things that a screen reader is going to share with you, communicate with you as you're navigating a website. So if you want to see a very accessible WordPress website, check out Lainey Feingold's website, okay? Okay, so I provided a bunch of WordPress accessibility resources at the end of this deck. I've also provided a list of other accessibility resources, some that have been mentioned in the slides, and then there's some additional ones here. So as a summary in this presentation, WordPress is a great platform. I'm a huge fan for creating beautiful, impactful, and accessible websites. Make sure that the content that you put on the website is accessible. Make sure your themes are accessible from the start, and choose your plugins carefully. And by all means, test, test, test. Test at the beginning, test at the end, test whenever you make changes, okay? And WordPress makes a major impact on the digital world. Let's make it accessible. So for the final thing, I wanted to leave you with this brief video. This is a video that Apple came out with. It's called Sadie. It's out on YouTube. You can check it out. But as I think about the websites that we create, we're creating websites that act as solutions. They allow users to do something, okay? And creating accessible products, creating accessible websites, mobile apps, whatever the case may be, empower individuals with impairments and equal the playing field. I want to play this video, and then we'll wrap up with some Q&A.
People think that having a disability is a barrier. But that's not the way I see it. You can catch up with friends.
Ready?
You can capture a moment with your family. One face, small face, focus lock. And you can start the day bright and early. You can take a trip to somewhere new.
3 miles to the summit.
You can concentrate on every word of a story.
A bird began to sing. Jack opened his eyes.
You can take the long way home. Or edit a film like this one. When technology is designed for everyone, it lets anyone do what they love, including me.
So that was Sadie Paulson. She has cerebral palsy, and she is a video editor and submitted that video to Apple, who decided to use it and her in their advertisements on the accessibility of their products. So I find that very powerful. So I'm finished. I thank you very much for the attention you provided, and I'm very happy to open this up to any questions you may have that you may have time for, because I realize I spoke way too much.
We did have a couple of questions in the chat. One was, you sort of answered it, but just to be sure, can a carousel or slider reasonably be made accessible, or should you just not use carousels?
Well, I would say not use carousels only for their effectiveness overall. As far as whether a carousel can be made accessible, yes, it can. However, there's a lot of things to consider. There was a link that I provided that is accessibility tutorials. I do believe they actually have a tutorial on carousels. So if you create a carousel structured in that manner with the properties, you should be in fairly good shape.
And this, I think, was talking about, when you were talking about forms, I think this question is related to plugins for helping forms be accessible. And you mentioned for Contact Form 7, and we had a question, do you know of any that work with Ninja Forms?
I don't know of any. However, I would say that for Ninja Forms, what you want to do is go out to the plugin repository, search on Ninja Forms accessible or accessibility, and see if someone has actually created. Ninja Forms is a fairly popular forms plugin. I am aware of it. I've never used it, but I'm aware of it. I can only imagine that someone has attempted to address those issues. If not, there are things that you can do when creating forms. And I'm not familiar with Ninja Forms, so I'm not sure how forms are created. But if you have access to the actual code as far as laying out the fields and so on and so forth, there are things that typically you can do. They may have documentation to where you can associate form field labels. I'm not sure about, error messaging and stuff that's dynamic, so that's done by the plugin itself. But as far as creating accessible labels for form fields and such, there's a pretty good chance that you'll be able to do that either out of the box or reading up their documentation, or if you find a plugin that adds accessibility to it.
Thank you. And another question we had is, are there any page builders doing a reasonable job of accessibility?
I was afraid you were going to ask that question. I am not aware of any. With that said, that does not mean that there aren't some that are, let's say, more accessible than others. The fact that nothing comes to mind means that accessibility has not been touted. And I don't mean by the company, but let's say by others in the accessibility field for saying, hey, this is a great platform. Let's say Wix or whatever the case, whatever those, and I'm not talking about WordPress page builders right now. I'm talking about other platforms. Say, oh, well, they've added alt text, yeah, but you still can't get to your, form controls, So I would say that as far as page builders, you might want to do some, I hate to say Google searches, but you might want to search to see if any of the page builders for WordPress, if they are writing about accessibility, if they're touting their accessibility features. And, when it comes down to it, if you're considering using it, download it, install it locally, and test away. See, obviously, unless you're an accessibility professional, you're not going to, know everything to check. But, you have WCAG, so you have the guidelines. So if you go through each one of those sort of as a checklist and say, okay, is there focus indication? I press the tab key, go through. Does everything, can I see where I am? Or can I use a keyboard to do things? If you get good enough to use a screen reader, you can then start using it with the screen reader and say, okay, here's something I built with this page builder. Can I understand the who, what, when, where's? So, you know, what is this thing? What state is it in? So on and so forth. But I would definitely, you know, if I find something on page builders that provides some good information on the state of accessibility, I'll definitely tweet it out within this next week. So if you follow me on Twitter, you will you'll get the most up-to-date information.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions for Dennis before we wrap up?
Yeah, I got one. This is Keenan. Sorry. You mentioned a little bit ago that kind of even like black text on a white background isn't necessarily, you know, the kind of, that's what I've always viewed as kind of the gold standard of accessibility, right? Like that's how the web started, and with no CSS or JavaScript or anything getting in the way, you know, that was what I always viewed as kind of the gold standard. And you mentioned that wasn't necessarily the case. And so I'm curious as to what maybe your recommendations would be if, you know, we're kind of operating along the spectrum, like how accessible something is. Like if that's not one end of the spectrum, kind of how do you strike that balance of making something, you know, quote unquote, the most accessible that it can be? I know you kind of touched on it, that's not always possible, and you're always kind of, it's standard you're striving for, but do you have any thoughts on that?
The thought I have on that is a quote from, he's the lead accessibility engineer at LinkedIn. And he once said, there is no such thing as complete accessibility. And so to tack on to that quote, when you make something accessible, and of course it depends on what we're talking about, but, and so in the case of what you're talking about color contrast. And I learned this when I was running the meetup, because when we do presentation slides, I was like, hey, do this. And then I found out someone says, yeah, but actually that I can't read that. It's like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that. You're gonna fail. First off, you're gonna fail. Even if you try, based on guidance, you're gonna fail someone. What's accessible for 89 people is going to fail for 13 or whatever number. You always do. I think if you want to be an ethical, empathetic WordPress designer or developer, what you want to do is do your best, test as you can. I mean, literally, testing can be, you know, you buy someone a cup of coffee, say, hey, could you look at this and let me know your thoughts. Just get people's feedback, and more importantly, you know, let's say if it's your site and you've implemented something, make sure that you have a very easy mechanism to gain feedback. And most importantly, because, you know, I would say people with disabilities in the past, at least, have been the most cynical because they have felt they've never been heard. I think that is improving in some areas. So if you show that, if someone says, hey, I noticed that you have this, well, this is actually, you know, doing this, you know, it's harsh, it's glaring to me or whatever, then you may think of a creative solution to where you maintain a certain level of color contrast, but you switch something up to where now it doesn't impact that person. Now, to be honest, there's going to be someone somewhere that may still be impacted or who is newly impacted. There is no such thing as complete accessibility, but what we try to do is use best practices and holistic information that we have to design. And, you know, if we're using WCAG, we're setting out to meet those guidelines. And then more importantly, because the guideline, you can have a site that passes WCAG AA and it'll be completely non-usable. So, or bad experience. So you still want to account for user experience and usability when you're designing for accessibility.
Hey, thanks. Anybody else with a question?
Yeah, it's Scott. Hi, Dennis. First of all, thank you so much. I mean, this is a boot camp. I appreciate that. I just want to say one thing. I have one. You know, Becky's not here, and Becky's usually our devil's advocate, right? So I'll play Becky here for a second. And
Cool.
I want to rant for 1 second. Okay. You know, I try to do everything I can to make my sites accessible to my best ability, given that most of my sites are small sites, or my own sites, that kind of thing. But it's really unclear to me, and you just said this too, that it's impossible to be completely accessible, right? Because of people have different needs and different types of accessibility needs and stuff like that. But then we go so there's lawsuits on this, right? To say that we have to sort of make a reasonable accommodation for accessibility. And then one thing I like that you're doing, Dennis, is that you're making this information accessible to developers, right? But there's this huge disconnect from like what we need to do, what we should do, and what we have to do with accessibility. And I just wish there was a better solution for that,
Well, so, as far as, I can sit there and say WCAG 2.1 AA, and that's based on, the guidance, that's based on lawsuits and settlements. That's what what has come out of those to saying this is the baseline accessibility that you need to follow. The classic point is today, you can have a completely AA accessible website with WCAG. But if your touch points, your touch targets are too small and they're difficult to tap on a phone, you're still compliant. No one can tell. I mean, I guess someone could try to sue you. But if you are saying, listen, I'm following the gold standard, the standard level of compliance, WCAG 2.1 AA, and yes, I understand that you're saying you have these touch points. Now, mind you, what's going to keep you from being sued is by responding and hopefully acting on that response. So if someone says, this is a problem, then you could say, thank you for that information. Thank you for that insight. Here's what we plan to do. You do something like that, I'm not aware of anyone who's been sued. The reason why Target got sued is because they didn't do anything. If you do something, starting by just responding, addressing typical concerns is I can't do this. It's going to be less about, color contrast. It's important, but it doesn't have the same amount of weight as a keyboard user who's unable to click continue on, let's say, a multi-page form to buy something. Okay, so you have something like that that has that's a critical impact compared to someone who's having difficulty who might have to switch to Windows high contrast. And even though they lose the product images, but now they can see the form, that they have to work to get it, while someone who's unable to use a keyboard to hit continue, that's going to be a blocker for anyone except for a mouse user. So it really depends on what the issue is. But I understand what your frustration is. And, as fulfilling as accessibility is for me, it also is one of the leading frustrations because there are so many, if it depends. And I tend to be a very, black and white, either or, here's what you're supposed to do. And then it depends creeps in. And that can lead to frustration because all I'm trying to do is do the right thing, trying to make something accessible. So I hear you, but as long as you are, as you say, trying to do the best you can, you add those text alternatives, you're using a color palette that is accessible, maybe 95% of it is accessible from a color contrast, and you've missed something, if someone calls you out on it, if you, oh, okay, and I address it, you're gold. Because you did address, no one is looking to you as a site owner or creator of being perfect, but you are expected to respond and act on that response.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. It's just you get frustrated when you have tools that say you're only 98%.
Oh yeah,
You know, and it's like
there's people who use Google Lighthouse for accessibility, and they've hit 100%. There's someone in Austria who wrote an article talking about how they passed Google Lighthouse 100% accessibility, and then they showed how inaccessible the site was. And that's a ding. That's to show you how automated testing really covers only the 30%, and there's so much more where things can fail. So,
thanks. More questions? Okay. Dennis, thank you so much.
thank you.
It was very valuable.